Slave Zero is a third-person action game from the late 90s, where the main character Chan gets his mind permanently placed into a giant biomech called a slave. The reason for this fairly drastic mind transplant is this corporate dictator called SovKhan is trying to take over everything. By raising a massive army of giant biomech slaves, once complete will make him unstoppable. But this group of mystical resistance fighters called the Guardians managed to steal one of these biomech slaves and pop one of their members' minds into it. Also they decide to give it a cool edgy name, Slave Zero. Very 90s. So now it's your job to stop the SovKhan by waging a one-man war against his forces, which include fighting your way through a city full of biomech minions, and destroying nice chunks of the city in the process. The game is supposed to give you a feeling of scale, as you are a giant mech, but the old graphics haven't really aged well enough to keep it convincing. Like the civilians on the street are basically a few pixels. It's one of the few reasons I put off playing this game for a long time. I was pretty sure my rose-tinted memories from playing it when I was younger were not going to hold up, and probably be shattered by the reality of what the game is actually like to play nowadays. So to delay reality from setting in, let's chat about who made the game for a bit. The game was made by Infogrames, who are probably best known for their Alone in the Dark games and maybe Master of Orion 3, as well as a ton of, let's say, B-tier games. But now they've changed their name to Atari. I don't know why you'd want to change the name of your company to one that was a leading factor in the 1983 video game crash. It's probably because the name has some nostalgia for gamers who imagine a better time in gaming, when they should face the facts that it wasn't as good as they remember.
Kinda like how you remember this game.
Hey, don't get smart with me, I know where your off button is.
Critical feedback is vital for self-improvement.
What were we talking about? Oh yeah, Atari. They don't own the rights to the game anymore, and it's now owned by Tomo, who released it on GOG and with some little extra help from Night Dive Studios released it on Steam. But the game needs some help to run decently on modern systems because the game wasn't made to be played on widescreen or ridiculous resolutions like 1080p. There are some tools provided in the GOG version to get it running in 1080p, but you'll still have issues, like your crosshairs won't line up anymore and the lock-on for missile weapons won't work. But there are fan-made patches and tools made to fix these issues, which I'll put a link to down below. The only problem I couldn't find a solution to is the aspect ratio, so you're going to need to choose between Snyder cut or slightly squished. Pick your poison. Anyway, with most of the problems sorted, we can get a good look at the game. The visuals for the game are fairly basic, but has some of that late 90s style still show up here and there, even if it is a little blocky. Though it gets the dystopian cyberpunk vibe going with the occasional neon lights in a very overdeveloped urban setting. The soundtrack is pretty solid. It's mostly techno and suits the game's tone and pace while being fun to listen to. Some of the music even has a little Blade Runner vibe going to it in some of the tracks. I enjoyed most of the music as it did a good job of supporting the action on screen, which is surprisingly fast paced at times with the controls being pretty responsive. They may want to change some of the assigned buttons like the jump one, which felt better to me on the spacebar. You'll need to be quick with the controls to avoid enemy fire while dishing out some damage yourself. Like I said before, you're supposed to get a sense of scale being a giant mech, and it did for me back in the day. But playing it now, I feel like I'm in one of those old Godzilla movie sets with fairly noticeable scale down props and the cardboard buildings. Destructibility of objects isn't so much them breaking down as them kind of awkwardly sort of melting with explosion effects. But at least there's sometimes health or ammo in the buildings you destroy. Yeah, this is an old school game, remember, so no regenerating health and you live or die by health pickups. Also, you can run out of ammo if you're a little too trigger happy, but most of the time the game is fairly generous with the pickups. There are going to be times mostly in the second half of the game where you're going to need to be careful not to waste ammo, especially in boss fights. Though you'll be able to find extra health and ammo in slightly hidden sections of the levels, and sometimes even weapons you would only find later in the game usually. You can only carry 3 weapons at a time and they each have their own ammo type. One is regular ammo, another is missiles, and the last is energy based. The weapons are this game's only version of an upgrade system, as they tend to be just better versions of the previous ones you had, but you'll use more ammo per shot, with some having differences in the way they work. They make taking on enemies that were harder to bring down in earlier levels easier to beat. But it's been inconsistent as the higher tier weapons use too much ammo or because of how they function are less effective than the lower tier weapons. So you may be swapping out to lower tier weapons just so you don't run out of ammo. One example being this mortar weapon, which is powerful, but because it shoots projectiles in an arc kind of like a grenade launcher, it won't be the best at taking out long range or flying enemies. No! But the game lets you pick up weapons to swap for ones you find around the levels, though it might have been a better system if you kept access to all the weapons you find, instead of only being able to swap out to ones you find lying around, as you won't know what loadout you'll need against upcoming enemies. So it's a bit of an odd mix where you have weapon choice but you're kind of downgrading yourself a little if you use weapons from earlier in the game, but maybe you'll like the challenge of taking on harder enemies with weaker weapons. Speaking of enemies, the game does offer a fair variety of them, from grunts to snipers to flying ones. They each have their own unique way of taking you on, but because of how cramped the levels are at points, and how few are on screen most of the time, it can get a bit mundane to take them on, once you know their attack patterns and their weaknesses. There were a few times when the game would open up a bit and have a nice mix of enemies, which was a bit of a combat puzzle to figure out who to take on first, but also by this point in the game you might have extremely powerful weapons which might reduce the challenge a little. Which you can understand a little why the devs did this, because as you play through the game you are as vulnerable as when you started it. Your only defense is to dodge incoming fire and being evasive while attacking, because you're pretty squishy once you start taking on tougher enemies later in the game, or even just hiding behind cover to take pot shots. So the more powerful weapons might be the only thing keeping you alive, as you won't be getting any health or armor upgrades later. The fact that you're so vulnerable forces you to keep moving and dodging incoming fire. It keeps the action fast paced most of the time, which I remember liking about the game. It may have made me forget some of its shortcomings as a third person shooter, which is that it lacks a bit of depth. You can get away with just shooting and dodging mindlessly for most of the game to get through it. With only a few enemies you'll have to know when they are vulnerable to shoot. There are missions that try to offer a bit of variety, but these are the old cursed type missions. You know, the ones where you have to escort or protect something which is fairly vulnerable and will at times have you reloading saves just to get through? The reason why these missions are hated by so many gamers will only be reinforced by this game if you play it. But at least the game allows you to save nearly anywhere, and there aren't too many of these types of missions. Quick tip, don't rely too much on checkpoints as those tend to be far apart from each other. But apart from those old cursed missions, you're going to have some platforming to do. But at least there's a ledge grab that works most of the time. Some enemy attacks do have a knockback to their shots that, when combined with the levels where you're standing over a city abyss, can lead to an instant death. Have fun with that. Something I wish the game did is mix enemies together more, as most of the time you'll only fight 2 enemy types at once. Which the first time you fight will be a little bit of a challenge, as you don't know how they attack or how they move. But after fighting them once, you'll have them figured out. What might have made it more interesting is that they put more combinations of enemies together. But the game tends to rely on an endless spawn mechanic, which, to be fair, the game shows you how to stop by taking out these service elevators where they spawn. They even give sound cues so you know that more enemies are coming in and that there are elevators nearby. Though this led to an annoyance for me, which is when they hid the spawn elevator somewhere inaccessible in the level and you couldn't take it out. They do this so they can spawn a bunch of enemies without you stopping them. But what's annoying is you keep hearing the sound of the enemy spawning in, but you can't do anything about it. It's usually for flying enemies which are weak, but it's still annoying nonetheless. Something else that was hit or miss for me were the boss fights. Most of them are okay, but others are just a pain to get through until you figure out what the game wants you to do. Though the second to last boss fight was probably the one I had the most fun with, which I won't spoil yet. Speaking of spoilers, let's chat about the story quick, so if you don't want spoilers, skip to here. Okay, so after Chan's mind gets placed in the Slave Zero by this Guardian resistance group, they pretty much just throw you into the city to blow stuff up. These early missions are just of the tutorial type. Getting used to fighting enemies, even easy to beat mini-bosses which become a normal enemy later in the game. As you go through the missions, they try to make the Guardians that you're a part of feel like a mystical order of monks, with one of them who kinda acts like your mentor, trying to give you vague advice over the radio like Obi-Wan Kenobi in A New Hope, by saying stuff like, trust your feelings. But I found this not very helpful most of the time.
Take control of Slave Zero with your mind and with your soul.
Like in an early point in the game, after you're done causing havoc in the city, you get called back to base as now the SovKhan is retaliating against your little rampage in the city. The radio chatter from your allies makes it apparent that if you don't come soon, they are gonna lose.
Enemy forces closing in. ETA. They're practically on top of us. If you don't get here soon, don't bother coming.
So instead of your mentor giving you an idea where to go through these tunnels, he starts talking about trusting your feelings to find the way. No, Grandpa, actual directions would be better, please. You eventually make it back to base, which you have to defend, obviously. Then you have to help evacuate the last of the Guardian's dark matter, which is the stuff they need to make more Slave Zeros to fight the SovKhan. So you help escort these very fragile boats through the sewers. The SovKhan, who is now pretty annoyed with you, sends out one of his more powerful minions to try and take you out. And you get your first proper boss fight, who sounds a lot like Starscream.
No, it cannot be. It's impossible.
The story continues with you going after different objectives in the city, like getting more slave embryos so the Guardians can make more units like you in the future. The characters don't really develop that much, as the few cutscenes in the game are usually focused on the SovKhan reacting to your exploits and taking out his frustrations on his commanders. Sucks to be that guy, oof. Like, you don't really get a sense to why Chan is fighting, as he never says anything and the Guardians are, as you know, a little vague on stuff. I mean, he does do a robot roar sometimes, but that's about it for his dialogue. So the story kind of follows the path of go here, shoot thing, and eventually you get a boss to fight. Some of which are literally just big objects which you slowly whittle down the health of while enemies spawn. These fights aren't the best and you can run through the game fairly quickly too. There is one good boss fight in the game, which is the second to last one, where you go into a dark matter reactor and fight the spider looking slave Mech that forces you to jump and move around to avoid its attacks in order to defeat it. You also get this game's version of the BFG once you do beat it, which is fun to use. But that is when the game peaks, as the last boss you fight is obviously the SovKhan, who has his own personal giant biomech slave which he sits in the head of. It's way bigger than any other you fight, but this fight is a bit of torture to get through, as you can only damage him on the head and you can't waste any of your shots either. Because if you do, then you get into a situation where you can't win at all. What doesn't help is the boss just walks back and forth while you have to hide behind this one central structure so his OP attacks don't hit you. So you spend most of your time just waiting for him to get into position so you can hit him. It's tedious and feels more like you're cheesing the boss fight than doing what you did most of the game, which is being evasive and outmaneuvering your enemies. After you eventually beat the SovKhan, he takes the classic villain fall off a cliff and monologues about how his children will awaken to destroy you. Even your mentor hints that this is the beginning of something.
Look carefully. This is the beginning. You are the future.
Nope, Grandpa, no sequel for you. Playing the game again made me see all the flaws I overlooked when I was younger, though I still had some fun playing it now. The game's not a total train wreck. It had some interesting story ideas, like a human mind being placed inside a giant biomech, though it doesn't do much with it. Also, the combat can be fast paced and fun at times, though it's let down by very linear small levels. The enemies are fairly one note and needed a bit more to make them enjoyable to fight against over and over again. If you're really into retro shooters, it might be worth picking up just to see what gaming was like back in the day. If you liked this video, consider subscribing. See you next time.
In the ways of the Guardian Warrior, it is not in you to fail. Your people depend on it.
Why are you the way that you are?